Hello, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. And wherever you are in this wide, wonderful, beautiful world that we live in, you are very welcome to the Global Sales Leader Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Cooper. This podcast is dedicated to sharing golden nuggets of knowledge, inspiration, valuable insights from experts around the globe. And our guests have a diverse field such as sales, leadership, coaching, psychology, success, behavior analysis, body language, coaching, and so much more. So whether you're a seasoned sales professional just starting out in your journey, our aim is to help you learn, grow, excel by giving value to others. Today, I'm thrilled to announce a guest that amplifies the fusion of expertise in human behavior, communication, and practical application that drive success. And Joe Navarro, you are very welcome. I'm very excited to have you on there. I'm extremely humbled and honored, and I know we're going to have an exciting conversation.
Well, thank you, Jason. I'm really looking forward to sharing this time with you and your audience. I know it's been on the schedule for months, so I've been looking forward to finally meeting you.
And in my head, it's been on my schedule for years. So I finally built up the courage to actually reach out to you, because one of the reasons I've reached out to you, I've read several of your books, and I recently did your audiobook, and I think I sent you some synopsis of that because you were suggesting about running at some point, and I can't remember the context behind it. And I was listening to your podcast while your audiobook while I was running as well, and there were certain things that really highlighted what you did. So I had to write back to you and just say that really sort of resonated with me. So
it's an interesting story that it was in my book, Be Exceptional, and it was one of those. You know how it's weird how often it's a fortuitous event, totally unplanned. I was in San Francisco to attend an event, and I'm being driven to the event by this gentleman from who was in graduate school from I think it was either Tanzania or East Africa somewhere, and he was listening to a race that was taking place on the radio, and so he asked me if I minded. I said no. We had a 45-minute drive, and we're both listening to who was going to win this marathon. And as we're driving, he said the gentleman in the lead, he says, he's from my tribe. And I said, you're kidding. And so we started talking about racing. He says, yes, I used to be a racer. And then the race was over, and he turned off the radio, and he said, and I said, because I always try to make friends with the people that I'm being driven around by. Mm-hmm. I always find them fascinating, especially in a new city. Cab drivers and Uber drivers know all the best places to eat, especially if you're looking for ethnic food. I said, if you don't mind me asking, I said, what is it about East Africa, Tanzania, Ethiopia, many of these countries that turns out so many great marathoners? You can almost predict who are the marathoners that are going to win. And he thought deeply for a minute, and he said, the media. And I said, what? He says, the media. And this is what was fascinating, because a lot of people might say, well, it's genetically we have been running for so long, or maybe we have fast twitch muscles, which I know some groups of people have faster twitch muscles than I do, and any number of things. But he says, when I was growing up, we didn't know what world records were. We had no media. There was no newspaper. There weren't any radios. You had to run from here to school or here to the next village. And nobody said, can you do it under 8 minutes? We just ran as fast as we could. And he says, I think it's because we didn't have media to tell us, oh, the world record is 4 minutes, 33 seconds. So we'll just run that fast. but not more. And I thought that was an interesting take on the concept. And I was working on my book at the time, the concept of self-imposed restrictions
Mm.
that I myself had experienced. That, and we do it to ourselves. You know, unless you have a PhD, you cannot observe the world around you in the same way.
Mm.
Well, some of the greatest observations, whether it was Benjamin Franklin left school in this, I believe, the 5th or 6th grade, and decided, I think I'm going to test out where all this static electricity comes from, and lightning and so forth. The concept that somehow, unless you're this, you cannot do that. And I think we self-limit that just because you don't have this kind of education, or you didn't grow up in this part of town, or this or that, that you cannot find things, discover things, explore things, or go beyond what is dogma in many cases. And I think that was one of the things that hit me, that exceptional people are not bound by the imposition of, I mean, imagine, you know, people forget that Picasso was an exceptional traditional painter. They just look at the abstract. He was a wonderful painter. And then one day he said, you know what? I think the face can be painted in different ways. And off he went. It was a metaphor, however accurate or inaccurate that conversation was, for the restrictions that we put on ourselves and the liberty that we have of freeing ourselves from that and saying, you know what? Maybe I can swim faster, dive longer, paint this, and be myself. Yeah.
And it's all done by our limiting beliefs, I suppose. I know there's a bit of a buzzword, but we are constrained by, I'm too old, I'm too young, I'm too big, I'm too small. My culture around me doesn't allow me to do that, or it's too hot out here, especially for the Kenyans. I stayed in Kenya for 3 weeks when I was lucky enough, when I was about 17. So I sort of understand where you went with that. And being in Kenya, I understood the foods, I understood the culture, and my friends were Kenyans that were living out there. So sort of broadened my horizons of our own constraints that hold us back in whatever ways and means that we do, whether I'm not smart enough, or sometimes school's not being taught in the right way that can help us learn and grow. But the question I'm curious about is, obviously yourself, I didn't give you a proper introduction because I went off in a tangent, but that's fine, is how you got into what you're doing now and the lead up from there, because I'm fascinated with your journey.
Yeah, my journey was one that no one could have planned. I certainly did not plan it. I was born in Cuba, or as they say in the UK, Cuba. You know, we had a little revolution there, and we immediately fled because things were horrific. I saw things that no child or adult should ever see.
Yeah.
When we went to America, having arrived in the United States, my mother spoke English, but I did not. And because both of my parents had to work multiple jobs a day, I was left alone quite a bit. And the question for me was, do I stay in the household or do I go out and play? And but how do I communicate? And at a very young age, somehow I managed to see the efficacy, the immediate efficacy, and the exquisite elegance of nonverbal communication. If somebody liked you, you immediately knew it. If somebody didn't like you, you also sensed it. And I became very attuned to that, to the point where I was pointing things out to my parents, who, God bless them, they were so busy trying to work and make ends meet that they often didn't have time to appreciate what was going on around them. And then it just became, I don't want to say it was an obsession, but I remember a lecture that Carl Sagan, the famous astrophysicist, gave. He was talking about how children are naturally born curious. Why this? Why is grass green? why is the sky blue? And the worst thing a parent can do or a school do is say, be quiet, sit down, don't ask, or I don't know. Well, if you don't know, those are actually really good questions. Why is grass green? And why is the sky blue? Those are not stupid questions. They're actually...
that completely resonates with me. My son said that to me the other day, so I completely concur with that.
Yeah. These are significant questions. And I was fortunate that my parents allowed me to pursue. We were dirt poor. We were very poor. So most of my reading I scrounged from garbage cans, where I would find magazines and books to read. And they allowed me to pursue things on my own. And I just had this natural curiosity. And I was living in South Florida at the time, in Miami. And in the wintertime, I wondered why, when the birds flew down, why, when they landed on the power lines, they would sit equidistant from each other, almost like a ruler. If you looked at a power line, if you squinted, it almost looked like a ruler. And you wonder, how do they know? How do they know to be equidistant from each other? In the same way that when people queue up for the bus, they were equidistant. And so it was something that I began to focus on is, well, what are the rules of social engagement, and where are those rules? And for instance, why did the people that were now around me, the Americans that were living there in Miami at the time, they hugged less than the Cubans, and they touched less than the Cubans? And what did all that mean? So by the time I got to college, I had accumulated hundreds of 3x5 cards, these little things that I still keep around with notations of my observations. And then when I was in college, I studied criminology, but my love really was of anthropology and the study of cultures.
That's really quite fascinating. Yeah.
And so, and then the Bureau approached me to apply to the FBI. I never anticipated that. And then I find that in law enforcement, all you really are is a paid observer. That's really all. As an FBI agent, that's all you do. And then, 25 years in the FBI, you're making constant observations, and then you retire and you're still young. And I was 50, and what do you do with that? And then somebody said, well, you ought to write a book about your observations. Anyway, it's a long story, but I never thought I'd be an FBI agent. I never thought I'd be writing books. I never thought I'd be lecturing. And I certainly never thought I'd be with Jason Cooper. And yet here I am.
Yeah. The world has a magical way of coming back on itself. And that's a good thing. I think the area that you're into is a must-have in today's society, because I know there was a lot of research, I think it was in maybe the 60s, maybe you can correct me on this, and hopefully you can, where they said nonverbals was 55%, and the vocal tonality was around about 30, and how we communicate was around about 7% or whatever. How accurate is that, and how specific? Because I just for my own personal self, because it's been thrown around the internet like anything, and some of the books I've read say that, but I just wanted to clarify that with yourself. What is it really? What does it look like?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. It may have been Dr. Moravian who threw out a number, and I think he threw it out there just to pacify the questioner. In my experience, having been looking at this since 1971, really when I started my studies in anthropology and then nonverbals, it really is contextual. You can have two people deeply in love staring at each other over a drink, and there is absolutely not one word being communicated. And yet non-verbally, the expressions of love, of kindness, of interest, of empathy, of allure are just they're literally overwhelming the circuits to the point where people say, I don't want to go. They're communicating so much silently that, oh, I don't want to go, but I got to go. No, I don't want to, right? And so I think it's very contextual. I think even, I was at an engineers meeting one time and we were talking about communication. And even there, I know that a lot was being communicated non-verbally versus verbally, because they talk mostly in numbers and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But something such as turn yielding. When should I be quiet and let the other person talk? Or that's interesting, but I don't agree with it. Or there's a certain level of nonverbals that is being communicated, including body chemistry. And I would say it's certainly, I think it rarely drops below 50%. I still think, in fact, I think in every article I've ever written, I said the primary means by which humans communicate is nonverbals. Just think for a minute. How we assess for safety. When you look through that peephole to see on the other side, we don't go by what they say. Otherwise, you could say mailman, and people would no matter what was there would let them in. Yeah. We mate selection, we know around the world, is based on nonverbals. The communication that takes place between mother and child in bonding and so forth. I think it's an extraordinary number, but to say it's 80 or 70, I think it's impossible to say. I think it's contextual, but I think it's very high. And I think when you consider, as my mentors, Desmond Morris, who I believe now lives in Ireland, David Gibbons, an anthropologist, when these individuals talk about the totality of communication, such as our skin tone, the fragrance of our own body that we give away, and so forth, it's extraordinarily high. I'll give you an example of how important these chemicals are. For instance, within 24 hours, young mothers are only 70% accurate in picking out their babies visually, but 100% accurate through smell.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. And there's also a direct correlation between oxytocin as well into the brain.
Yes, there's oxytocin, what we feel through touch, how we touch, how often, whether we do it with the palm of the hand or we do it with the fingertips. So, I don't really abide by numbers. I just say it is the primary means by which we certainly, just think about how we show empathy. Verbally, it just doesn't even register. We are a species that evolved to touch, to hug, to embrace. And so all of that is nonverbal.
And it's the reason why that brought me up again, it was just a lot of stuff thrown out there. And I was curious enough, after a lot of reading and studying myself, I was going, that just doesn't sound in line to what really is out there, because there's so much more out there. There's so much more, because we are, as human beings, we are social creatures. And when we have a look at the primates and we have a look at the ape families and all that, they're very sort of close community-based creatures. The same as ourselves. We're pretty much fairly similar to that in lots of respects.
DNA-wise, we are extremely close. We're 98%. Our behaviors are so similar. A mother ape will sit there and hold the baby and gaze on the baby and kiss it with its lips. I was at a hospital the other day visiting somebody, and as I walked by the neonate ward, they were doing the same thing. And how we touch, how often we touch, the power of any funeral. What goes on at a funeral? There's a lot of hugging and touching, because that transmits more information at a human level more powerfully than any single word you can say. Somebody asked me the other day, I have to attend a funeral. What do I say? And I said, don't say anything. They looked at me like, don't say anything. If there's nothing that just jumps out at you, just one, be there, presence. Our own presence communicates how we look at the person, and just give them a hug. And that's exactly what they did. So it is the primary means by which we communicate, which then brings us to a question you asked or alluded to, and that is, well, what happens now when we're all texting and we pay a price for that? We pay a price for being instrument fixated, and society is certainly paying a price. We now have young people going into medicine who don't know how to talk to their patients.
Yeah, I think that's really quite challenging, and I tell you the reason why is when my father was in hospital back in April, he's now passed, there was a young doctor, practicing doctor in there, and she was trying to communicate with my father by sticking a needle up his spine anyway. But I was trying to calm him down, and she just couldn't communicate that well. And I just had to say, look, I'd rather you not say anything and just get on with the job while I speak to my dad and just put some pictures in his head about playing golf or whatever else. But it was that the bedside manner which wasn't there, and there was a slight disconnect. Maybe that's something to do with learning, something to do with growth. So where I'm alluding to now is the area that you've been into, and being into business and the business world now. I think it's a fundamental skill that it has to be taught now, because the power of the nonverbals and to read people in like business scenario, and the area that I'm into is sales leadership and the psychology behind everything that they do. But a lot of it is what we're not saying, as opposed to what we are saying throughout our mouths, because a lot of the time it's incongruent.
Well, it's all of that. You're exactly right. Look, your story of your father and being in the hospital, now, they use these iPads to write down their notes. So that means you're not making eye contact with your patient. Humans, we evolved to make eye contact, to detect how much you're gazing at a person versus looking at a person. Information that we normally get there is not being received. And we know that indifference by a physician actually contributes to greater pain. It's a very complicated area. I get invited all the time to teach at hospitals, to teach what they should have learned at the 5th, 7th, 8th grade level, which is how do you talk to each other? Business, this is so important for business. If you look, here's an example. Most people are not familiar with the Harvard Grant studies. These were the longitudinal studies they started in 1936, 37, 38. They have continued till today, 80, 90 years on. What was the number one contributing factor to success of business people? Not IQ, not intelligence, not how much money their parents made. The number one thing that contributed to longevity and to success was the ability to connect with other people.
Yeah.
The order of earnings, the magnitude of earnings was mind-blowing. How much a person who is skilled at communicating earns so much more than a person who is not skilled at communicating, maybe smarter. First of all, is one of the most robust studies ever conducted. If you want to see somebody, if you were to take a 50-year-old and just say, what are your chances of living to 90? It is predictable just based on their ability to connect with others. Nothing to do with how much health care you can afford, not anything else. And so I'm confronted by this all the time. And people say, well, you don't spend a lot of time talking about deception. Forget about deception. Let the amateurs focus on that. What do we need to focus on? How to get along with each other, because that will contribute to your health, longevity, and earnings. The minute you say health, longevity, and earnings, business people will go, what?
Yeah, they open their eyes a little bit.
It's when they begin to pay attention. And I just had a meeting with, there were about 12 CEOs there. It was a special meeting, different industries, primarily financial, but they were from other sectors, including energy. And I said, have you looked at what you're hiring? And they said, what do you mean? Yeah, have you looked at who you're hiring? Are you hiring just because they graduated from this school, or are you hiring because these individuals know how to connect with others? Because I assure you that in 10 years, the ones that you hire for their ability to communicate and connect with others will bring you more profits. That's when you get their attention. Yeah. They will bring you more profits than any top-tiered school graduate. You can get those all day long. Oh, you were number one in your class? Congratulations. The United States has about 5,000 universities, so there were 5,000 of you. But people that can connect, my goodness, I shop around for them all day long, because they will make my profits go up.
That was something I was going to point on, actually, because the interviewing ways to how you interview for jobs and as an interviewer has slightly changed. And I know there's a lot of studies from Google is when they first started out, they were just looking for graduates and all that. They still are. But then they started to look at people with a bit of experience. And that exactly what you've just said, that can actually communicate with people.
That can, and not just communicate with people, but communicate with people across different generations.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, when I was in college, if you said, who's a top tier individual, who's earning a lot of money, you would say somebody in their 60s. Yeah. Well, there are billionaires now that are 27, 28, 29 years old. A millionaire, certainly. So the ability to communicate to a young person, as well as to communicate in my age bracket, right? Mm-hmm. And span that. And that's just communication. But think for a minute, Jason, about one of the most important things that we communicate non-verbally, because it's never done verbally, is how do you communicate trustworthiness? I asked this to business people.
Quite sorry, I jumped in there because what I'm thinking about, I just want to jump in there and across cultures at the same time.
Oh my, yes. Yeah. Well, let's talk about the two things. How do you communicate trustworthiness? Because nobody says, are you trustworthy? But we assess for it non-verbally. And people don't know how to convey trustworthiness. And then we get into this other area. Well, you've traveled through, in the United States, and I know you've been to Florida and other parts of the United States. And I get this question all the time. Well, why are Americans like this? And I go, stop right there. First of all, America is 5 time zones. Your country's only one. And which part of America? Because New York is not like San Francisco.
That's right.
The Native Americans that live on the Colorado River Indian Reservation are very different than the people that live in Missouri. That you're more likely to find somebody from New York and New Jersey in Miami than you are to find them. So which people are you talking about? And recognize that there are cultures within cultures. And that's a big thing, is how do you communicate to people that in essence live in the same country, but culturally they're different. And of course, anytime I travel abroad, immediately the rules of when in Rome, do as the Romans kick in.
Mm-hmm. Because I was going to say, actually, even on the handshakes, it's different everywhere. Like, I've been to India, and the handshake was, as they say, it's like a wet fish, like very loose. but I think everyone else in there was like that anyway. But isn't because the normal say throat handshake and this, that, and the other. But it's so different wherever you go.
Well, let's look at the handshake. If I ask, and I do almost in every presentation I do, and I ask, how many of you have had a bad handshake? And everybody raises their hand. I've never had anybody not raise their hand. And you say, how do people screw that up? And the fact is, most people screw that up, and they have different expectations. And you're right, whether it's Vietnam or it's or in India. It's just the mere touching of the hands. It's the engulfing of the hands. There's no squeezing. And then you go to Texas and some cowboy wants to squeeze your hand like he's milking a cow. And it's like, whoa, cowboy, I have arthritis. I do not want, first of all, I'm not impressed by your strength. I'm only impressed by your intellect. And secondly, I have arthritis. And and things like the handshake or spatial violations, where if you've been to Africa, as you have, if you've been to the Middle East and you've been to Asia, India, and so forth, spatial violations, the spatial needs are very much different. All of that, everything we've talked about is really about nonverbals. And how do we get along with others? How do we fit in? How do we communicate? I look at the people from the UK and Ireland and other places that have traveled to Africa and have established themselves there in communities, and you can always tell who fits in by the amplitude of their ability to precisely do that, fit in. To be one, learn the language, to eat their food. You say, why would you let your children take their shoes off? Because that's what they do when they run around and they have a great time. My wife, who grew up in Jamaica, parents, her mother was teaching there, her father was an engineer. She grew up, the kids took their shoes off and they ran around and it was okay, right? And, the minute she went back to the UK, you got to wear the shoes. Oh, yeah, right. There's fitting in. And when people talk about fitting in, it's mostly nonverbal. It's not about, we're going to talk about this topic. No, it's all those little things. And I would say 90% of it is nonverbal.
So the question I always like to ask is, if you were interviewing yourself by yourself, next to yourself, what sort of questions would you ask that you've never been asked before to provoke the inner workings of your mind? And to bring something else different to the conversation?
That's an interesting question. I think the question that I've never been asked that I would ask myself is, what provokes your curiosity? Why do you read 2 books a week? Why do you take a year off every year? Like 1 year I took off and all I read was everything I could on Oceania, right? The Pacific Islanders and their behaviors. 1 year I took off and all I read was books on the time of Pericles and the golden age of Greece or the Byzantine Empire. What provokes me? And I think I find it abhorrent to be ignorant, to not know, to not know that chlorophyll makes the grass green, that the particulates in the air, when they're struck by sunlight, make the sky blue. I detest not knowing. And I think that provokes me when I see something and I say, like 2 years ago, I wonder, why is it that we touch our face so much? Why not other areas of the body?
Yeah.
And you realize, as I explored it, it has to do with the fifth cranial nerve and the way it innervates the face and how short that nerve is between the face and the pons where it's connected. And so we could massage our knee when we were stressed, but touching our face is faster. And so for me, what provokes me is I don't really want to be ignorant. I want to fulfill, I want the richness that life provides.
Wow, that's an incredible answer. And touching the face, I don't know if you heard of EFT, which is the emotional freedom technique. And it's like tapping. They call it tapping. So you tap on certain areas of the body while you speak to yourself there and there and there. But it's mainly on the face. So
yeah, well, that touching technique is beyond my expertise. But when I looked at, because I had attended so many autopsies, and I always sat there, homicide cases, and I always had the doctors explain to me, everything. And one of the things that I notice is, you have the seventh cranial nerve, which is the facial nerve, but even more powerful is the fifth cranial nerve. And that nerve seems to explain, why we pinch our eyes closed when we are in pain, why we press our fingers into our eyes when we say, oh, no, why we go from touching the face to scratching the face. And I didn't see that answer anywhere. So I said, okay, I'm not waiting. I'm going to study it and I'm going to write about it. And I did for Psychology Today. Now, I'm hoping somebody will look at it and either prove it or disprove it. I don't care, but the one thing I'm not going to do is wait. Yeah. I'm not waiting to learn. So
curious to, as we're talking about learning, and I always like to say feed forward in everything that we do, about the mirror neurons. Like I've heard it so often, and I've actually started to use the language itself when there's that human connection with someone, whether it's by the narrative and you planting the seed and then imagine it something into their head. And I think you alluded to it earlier, regards to when a loved up couple are in congruence and aligned with themselves and they're in tune. Is that the mirror neurons that they get each other? Or is it an actual thing that's on the frontal head? Or I'm alluding to a question there, but
no. You're actually asking a profound question. I'm familiar with the book on mirror neurons and the research that was found. This bundle of nerves that actually are the neurons that explain it. Yeah. But if you I always take the broader view. I first start out with zoology, and then I go to primatology, and then to humans. If you look at from animals, for instance, many animals that are brought together, like you bring a sheep and a dog and you rear them together, they'll adapt behaviors. But for instance, you can get a sheep to chase after a ball if it grows up with two dogs.
Yeah.
Demonstrated many times. Well, what is that? There's something that is in our DNA, which basically is this: synchrony is harmony. That the quicker we can synchronize, the better we will harmonize. So get this: the baby in utero, right, still in the uterus, is listening to sounds. It will begin to mirror the intonation of the mother's voice to the point, and you can look this up, it's called the crying lilt, L-I-L-T. A baby born in France will have a different crying lilt than one born in the UK. Now, why is that? Is it the mirror neurons? That's beyond my expertise. What I do know is that for many mammals, the ability to mirror that which they have in their environment, which may be noises, which may be behaviors, allows them to fit in better. And that ensures their survival. And so that begins to shape whether or not the baby will be cared for, and whether they fit in, and so forth. I remember when I was in Puerto Rico for 5 or 6 years, and at a very young age, Puerto Rican babies are exposed to merengue music and salsa. And you see these little 14-month-old, 9-month-old babies sitting there swinging in exquisite harmony with their parents and with the music. And you tell yourself, in 15 years, that kid will be dancing merengue like there's no tomorrow. How beautiful to begin to fit in at that very early age with those movements. So whether it's the mirror neurons, but I think that the deeper question of mirror neurons is this why we experience certain things when somebody accidentally shoots their hand with a staple gun, and we have that same thing. I mean, obviously, I've seen it and so forth, which also explains why when people use Botox, they have a hard time being as empathetic as they normally would. But I mean, those are far beyond my expertise. Those are for neurologists, but I've certainly looked at it, and it's always interesting.
Well, that's a fascinating way as well. There's so much I want to ask you, but I know we're limited to time, but trickling a little bit forward into the leadership area, because I know you do a little bit of stuff in corporations around that. What advice could you give to up-and-coming leaders or established leaders that want to improve on their nonverbal communications? Big question, I know. There's lots of different areas that we could probably touch on. But that instant connection with people, we alluded to trust, respect, congruence with them. What other things can we look for?
Here's what I always tell leaders. And I learned this from coaching a lot of leaders, but also from listening to a lot of leaders. Number one is always know that you are being observed. Most of the time you think you're observing your team. No, everyone is observing you.
Mm-hmm.
And your attitudes will say a lot. I tell leaders how much I admire leaders who know the name of the receptionist, who know a little bit about their families, maybe the security guard, who take the time to go in the back and talk to the guy that takes deliveries. That gets out. The word gets out. This leader is empathetic. You don't have to walk around and be empathetic and say you're empathetic. You demonstrate empathy, and it changes the attitude of, well, maybe I should be doing that too. Or maybe I have a responsibility to pick up that piece of paper on the floor. You can set the atmosphere by how you treat everybody, but especially the least amongst us in as far as what they can do for you. As I always say, the true measure of an individual is how they treat those that can do absolutely nothing for them. Now, other people have said that. I don't take credit for it, but I often say it. The other thing is that leaders forget that, yes, it's nice to set visions for what you want to do. But the other thing that I've learned, and I learned this from military leaders, is that one of the most important things that you as a leader can do is not just set example, but to attenuate fear. That people that work for you will have fear and apprehensions about the economy, about this or that, or where we're going to be. Are we going to make our quarterly earnings and so forth? Or, gee, I don't know, I've never done this before. It says one of the biggest things about leadership is to deal with fear, which nobody calls it fear. Everybody calls it a doubt, apprehension, and so forth. But we all have fears. And it's the ability to step in there and either be a cheerleader and say, Joe, you can do it. In the book, I talk about this guy who said to me, Joe, I wouldn't be here with you at the bottom of this mountain if I didn't think you could climb it. And he put his hand on my back, and up the mountain I went. And I was scared. My legs were shaking. And I'll always remember this fellow. And that was the biggest thing he could do, is to attenuate that fear. And I've seen really when you look at what did Churchill do? Churchill did not bring one more tank into the equation, not one more aircraft. You were losing, on average 33 aircraft a day at the time he took over. what he brought to the equation was the attenuation of fear. In the same way that, and I'm not saying they borrowed from each other, in the same way that Roosevelt, in talking about the Great Depression, said you have to stop fearing. Fear is your greatest enemy. And that, I think, is a lot of leaders forget, that is their almost primary role, is to overcome fear, which isn't called fear. We call it other things: doubt, insecurities, and so forth. So yeah,
that's been really, the whole conversation today has been fascinating. I've been writing loads of notes down as we've been speaking. That always stimulates me to ask another question, because I'm completely fascinated with what you do, and I'd love to get you back on again so we can not interrogate you, but ask you a lot more questions so I can learn and I can grow, because I believe that this area is so very important. And I add it onto some of my trains, but there's a whole load of other things that I need to learn as well. But I just think it's fundamental in communication skills, but it should be at the forefront in most professional development courses that we do. And I think it should be at the forefront. And I absolutely 100% believe that it needs to be more into business organizations, and especially schools now, especially when it's harder and harder within the schools with technology distractions, phones and whatever else that's around us, because the internet is there to, it's a good source of information, but it can actually sabotage us as well.
I agree with you completely. The satisfaction you get from a device is the dopamine hit that you get. Patient of new information, it's lively. Humans cannot compete with dopamine hits from devices. We simply can't. We didn't evolve at 26 gigahertz, and so we can become over reliant because this is where we're getting the dopamine. But when it comes to relationships, we don't live off of dope. Most people don't realize that we don't live off of dopamine in relationships. We do during initial dating. What we live off for the rest of our lives, when we finally are in relationships or friendships, is, as you said earlier, the oxytocin, the sort of bonding, comforting chemistry that allows us to live long and healthy, not dopamine. Dopamine is what says, hey, why don't you go when you're take a year abroad? Yeah, I'll do that. But that doesn't last forever. And so we need to have that real conversation and say, it may be, as I saw this weekend, a family sitting down to dinner and both children had headsets on and iPads, and they're getting a dopamine hit and they're quiet, but it in no way contributes to the well-being of those children into the future. In no way. And I cannot accept any argument that says, well, but we don't know that, it's not scientifically proven. Try and take an iPad away from a child and they lash out. When in my lifetime did we see anybody lash out when you took a book away or something like that? It's because the power of dopamine to feed the pleasure centers. So I think it's a conversation we need to have, and I think parents have to be responsible for, are you sure you know what you're doing?
One last question. What is that red round ball next to you, just to your right-hand side, just below your book, behind you?
Oh, that's just a vase.
Right, okay. I wasn't sure whether that was the Death Star or something like that. But...
No, the red, it's a fired vase. Red is one of those colors that is hard to find. We were someplace visiting and they fired this in such a way that it brings out, there's some sort of metallic thing. And I thought it was beautiful.
I like it. I looking behind you and I go, oh, that looks unusual, looks Death Star-ish and Star
Yeah,
Wars
no, it's
connection there.
just a vase, just a vase. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being my guest today. And again, I could talk to you all day, and I find you absolutely fascinating. How else can people find out more about you? I always like to give that.
Well, thank you. You can reach me at jnforensics.com. I think you have it being shown there. I now have a YouTube channel. If you just go to YouTube and type in my name, you'll find I now have 93 videos that we've shot, and I always welcome questions from everybody, because questions make me think harder, and so I'm always happy to answer questions. So, Jason, thanks for taking the time to talk to me and making yourself available in this way. I really appreciate it.
Thank you once again. I really appreciate it as well. And I'm honored and humbled because so many more questions I need to ask. But again, we haven't got enough time today, but maybe another time.
Next year.
Next year, we'll get you back on.
Next
Absolutely.
year. All right.
Thank you again. Appreciate it.